I adjusted the straps on my gloves, triple-checking the seams, before I approached the latest client. Client, that's what we called them in Mortuary 7. It was supposed to remind us that these were people, even if they were on the wrong side of the line. The marketing division liked the sound of it, I think, as if a change in terminology somehow softened the idea of death. I'd long grown accustomed to the quiet of this place, the sense of frozen time that only a mortuary can create. I'd heard horror stories of people who'd worked in facilities like ours, doctors and scientists going half mad from hours spent with the dead. But for me, it was just work. Routine. I checked the screen on the quantum resonance capture device. The machine was a giant metal dome, lined with sensors that could pick up the faint quantum resonance left behind by brain activity in the moments right after death. It looked like an MRI, though bulkier, with cables snaking from the walls into the hub. I ran the standard diagnostics, watching the green lights flash in succession. Everything was in order. This was supposed to be simple. Death comes, brain activity flatlines, and the QRCD captures the fading echo. The resonance we'd collect here wasn't even supposed to last. Scientists said it was like catching the hum after an engine shuts down. Nothing of consequence, just fragments. I pulled up the client's chart on my tablet. A woman in her 70s, heart failure. Cause of death didn't matter, but knowing gave the process some structure, a sense of closure. Start capture sequence, I thought to myself, and the machine hummed to life. It clicked and whirred as it calibrated, each click marking an invisible journey into whatever remained in the moments after death. The chart filled with data points, each one an isolated burst of quantum information, the signature, as we called it. Numbers, graphs, calculations, the mechanical language of what had once been a life. Except this time, something was off. I squinted at the screen, wondering if the early hours were playing tricks on me. I'd run captures hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and the signatures always looked similar. Fuzzy patterns, disconnected spikes, like the aftermath of static. But here was something organized. The data was arranging itself into shapes, rhythmic pulses that almost looked like waves forming, then reforming, overlapping. I shook my head. Just a blip, I murmured to no one in particular, but something in me doubted that. I ran a diagnostic scan, expecting to see a malfunction warning, but everything came back clear, inexplicable. I tried to ignore the feeling, though it had burrowed into my gut like a tick. After all, equipment glitches happened, and just because I hadn't seen one like this before didn't mean much. Still, I couldn't resist running another scan, setting it to a more sensitive range, one we were advised not to use unless necessary. It was prone to picking up irrelevant background noise. This time, the screen filled with data lines that seemed to move, almost alive in their precision. There was a pattern, distinct and repeating in sequences that overlapped and doubled back. The pulses were sharper now, more defined. Not just noise, not a glitch. This was structured, an echo that shouldn't be there, lasting far longer than any capture I'd ever seen. My heart started pounding as the implications began to settle. Quantum captures, by design, were supposed to decay immediately. They weren't meant to last beyond a few seconds. Yet here I was, watching these patterns play out like ripples in a pond, lingering and returning with something bordering on intent. I called for my supervisor, Dr. Baines, to take a look. He was older, a scientist with the kind of pragmatic, almost dismissive attitude you'd expect in this field. He squinted at the data, scratching at his wiry beard, then let out a heavy sigh. "Isaac, you're seeing what you want to see," he said, waving a hand at the screen as if the patterns would dissipate at his command. "It's interference, probably just a feedback loop. The QRCDs aren't flawless." "But I've run diagnostics," I argued. "It's not noise, it's something organized. Look." I pointed to the pulsing peaks and valleys that had started to take on a familiar cadence, like the rhythm of speech. Baines gave me an unimpressed look, the kind that told me he thought I was being fanciful. "Save it to the archive and move on," he said dismissively. The signatures are just remnants. No sense in overthinking it. I clenched my jaw, nodding as he left, but his indifference felt like a slap. With Baines gone, I decided to dig a little deeper. What harm would it do to explore a bit further? I initiated another capture, this time amplifying the data sensitivity even further, beyond our protocols. The machine came to life once again, its sensors working at maximum output, and this time the patterns were even more pronounced. Each pulse, each frequency seemed to align into sequences, like broken parts of a language that was trying to form itself. My pulse raced as I stared at the screen. What if these weren't random patterns? What if the resonance capture wasn't just picking up echoes of a machine but something else? Something human? I'd always considered myself a scientist, grounded in logic and routine, just a handler for technology beyond my full understanding. But this wasn't science anymore. It was starting to feel personal. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an obligation to the data I was looking at, an obligation to the woman who had left this trace behind. Could I really dismiss it as a random blip, like Baines wanted? I was certain now. I'd stumbled upon something far more significant than a glitch. Something inside me, something human and curious, refused to let this go. I sat in front of the machine for hours that night, rerunning capture sequences until my eyes burned from staring at the screen. Each scan produced the same patterns, clear and unmistakable. These weren't random signals or fragments of memory. They were distinct, structured, like waves of thought caught in data form, looping and re-looping within the storage matrix. I couldn't explain it, but every pulse felt like an attempt to say something. After a few more hours of staring at patterns, I realized I couldn't go any further. I needed to try a different angle, something that could take these pulses and translate them into a form I could understand better. That's when I thought of the quantum feedback transceiver, an experimental tool that had been sitting in the back of the lab gathering dust. It was supposed to convert raw quantum resonance data into something more perceptible, audio and visual outputs. Technicians said it was a flawed, barely functional device, good only for detecting noise, but at this point, I was out of options. I dug the QFT out, brushed off a thin layer of dust and connected it to the machine. It lit up immediately, a display activating with a blue glow. A faint, distorted sound crackled through the speakers. At first, it was just a garbled hiss like white noise, but slowly it sharpened, becoming something almost like a whisper. Words began to form, warped and distorted as though passing through water. "Hello, hello." I froze, barely breathing, staring at the speakers as if they'd become possessed. The sound was fading in and out, but it was there. The quantum signature, this echo left behind by a dead mind, was speaking. I pulled the headphones from my neck, pressing them to my ears. "Who are you?" I asked, feeling absurd for talking to a machine, but too compelled to resist. For a few long seconds, there was silence. Then another faint phrase drifted through like static, molding itself into words. "Help! Trapped! Need!" My skin crawled. I'd heard voices echo in death rooms before, grieving family members, distraught partners, but this was different. This was a quantum signature communicating, responding, almost interacting. I was hearing the mind of a dead person reaching across the void, somehow aware enough to call for help. Over the next few days, I recorded every capture and analyzed each one obsessively. It wasn't just one voice. Different captures produced distinct voices, though all shared a certain muffled quality, as though they were speaking through thick glass. Some phrases were disjointed, repetitive, nonsensical, but others seemed organized, even coherent, like threads of thoughts woven together. It was as if the stored quantum signatures were aware of each other, communicating within the system, like inmates whispering through prison walls. I pulled up more recent captures, hoping to find an answer, and noticed something else. As more signatures were stored, the patterns grew more complex, like they were forming sentences, even arguments. One signature, the first one I'd heard, I suspected, would repeat the words, let us Let us, while another responded with a defiant, cannot, cannot. The significance of it all weighed heavily on me. These weren't isolated fragments of data. They were fragments of consciousness clinging together, trying to make sense of their situation. And, horrifyingly, they seemed aware that they were trapped. I knew what I had to do next, but dread sat heavy in my stomach. I had to tell Dr. Baines to bring this to someone with more authority than me. I was pushing against every boundary of our protocols, veering into territory we were forbidden from even speculating about. But I couldn't just sit by and ignore what I was hearing. The voices were pleading, forming fractured messages that no quantum fragment should be able to produce. I brought my recordings and data charts to Dr. Baines, watching as his face shifted from boredom to frustration, then finally to a kind of reluctant disbelief. "Dr. Walsh," he said, rubbing his temples as he closed his eyes, "I thought we went over this. Quantum signatures are data fragments, no more alive than a photograph. You're anthropomorphizing data patterns." "Baines," I insisted, almost pleading, "you're not hearing what I'm hearing. I'm not saying I understand how it's happening, but these signatures, they're conscious. They're communicating. It's almost as if—" "As if what?" he interrupted, his eyes narrowing. I hesitated. "As if they're fragments of souls, or consciousness in some form." His expression darkened, shifting from disbelief to outright dismissal. "This is reckless, Isaac. You're projecting your emotions onto fragments of resonance. Nothing more." He threw the recordings back at me. "Delete these. We don't need rumors of pseudo-scientific nonsense spreading to investors." I watched him walk out, stunned and seething. Baines had dismissed it, just as I'd feared, but I knew what I'd heard. It didn't matter what he thought. I was responsible for these people, or whatever was left of them. After Baines's dismissal, I decided to work alone, keeping my experiments off the books. I scheduled late-night sessions, pulling up more recent captures, and ran them through the quantum feedback transceiver, each scan adding more voices to the haunting archive. It was risky. If Baines caught wind of this, he'd shut down my access to the equipment entirely. Through these secret sessions, I discovered a new layer of interaction between the signatures. They weren't just communicating with me, they were communicating with each other. The QFT's visuals began picking up signals that resembled diagrams, almost like primitive images forming on the screen. Interlocking rings, lines intersecting like constellations. The voices would fade in and out, each signature almost competing for dominance, as if debating with one another. "Escape," one would murmur. "Together," another would echo. "Fear," "Hurt," a third whispered, faint but clear. Every time I plugged in a new capture, the others would respond, like pieces of a puzzle connecting in some larger pattern. The voices became more insistent, repeating words like freedom and body, sometimes even mentioning names, faces, vague memories trying to reform in the void. I began to feel I was eavesdropping on something I had no right to witness, something private, sacred. Each new interaction deepened my unease. What did this mean for us as a species, that we could capture fragments of souls, trap them in digital prisons without even realizing it? These were people, not just echoes. They remembered bits of themselves, their former lives, and they were suffering, if their words meant anything. I couldn't stand it. I had to find a way to help them. And yet, in the back of my mind, a darker thought troubled me. If I released these signatures, what would they do? What would they become? By the third week of my covert investigation, sleep had become a distant memory. I spent my nights in front of the machine, picking up new signatures and listening to the trapped voices trying to break free. Each session brought a new wave of whispered phrases, fractured but persistent. The phrases weren't just repetitions now. They were shifting, evolving, as if the voices were learning to communicate more clearly. I was sure of it. These signatures were fragments of consciousness, each one clinging to its own version of existence. I'd unwittingly become a witness to their suffering, and it was tearing me apart. But then another anomaly appeared, one even stranger than the voices. It started with an unusual sequence from one of the signatures, a new capture, one that had immediately come to life in the storage matrix. Instead of the usual garbled words or faint phrases, this one emitted a powerful, almost aggressive resonance that the QFT struggled to process. It was as if this fragment was reaching, straining for something beyond the walls of Mortuary 7. I ran diagnostics to check the equipment, but the machine was working fine. Whatever this was, it was real. That's when I noticed the nearby hospital on the monitors. We'd established a network link with them as part of our contract, allowing us to monitor brainwave activity in nearby facilities. And right as the resonance spiked, a newborn in the hospital experienced an abrupt spike in brainwave activity. The baby's readings soared off the charts, almost mimicking the frequency I was observing in the signature. This was beyond coincidence. I watched, transfixed by the data feed, and a cold sweat prickled my skin. The implications hit me like a hammer. Was this signature attempting to transfer itself? Was it reaching into that newborn's consciousness? I spent the next few days running more tests, replaying the data, trying to find any rational explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe it was just a random spike, a one-off coincidence. But the more I analyzed, the more I saw a pattern. Each time one of the newer, stronger signatures appeared, the newborn ward experienced corresponding fluctuations in brainwave activity. And each time, the spike followed the same rhythm as the resonance frequencies recorded in the machine. It was as if these trapped fragments were sending signals, probing the area around them, searching for something malleable and new. The thought was staggering. I was no expert on infant neurology, but I understood enough to know that newborns had a type of mental flexibility that adults didn't. Their brains were still forming neural pathways, open to shaping and influence. If the quantum signatures were actively reaching for something, the implications were chilling. The dead weren't just trying to escape, they were trying to come back. One late night, unable to resist, I used my credentials to pull records from the hospital. I shouldn't have, but I had to know. The birth records matched up with our storage archives. Each baby that experienced a resonance spike had been born within days of a significant quantum capture at Mortuary 7. And worse, a few parents had reported strange behavior in their children. An unusual level of awareness, almost unsettling eye contact, as if these newborns were holding on to something foreign, something unfamiliar. It was all coming together in the most horrifying way possible. These fragments weren't content to remain in stasis. They were fighting, clawing their way back into the physical world through the minds of these children, merging with unformed consciousnesses in a desperate bid for life. The weight of what I'd uncovered began to haunt me. Every night the faces of those newborns floated into my thoughts. I imagined them staring up from their cribs with wide, knowing eyes, infants holding secrets too large for their small bodies. I imagined voices in their heads, voices from people long dead who were supposed to have moved on. And I'd had a hand in this. I was the one who'd pushed for further captures, who'd run tests and experiments until I'd trapped souls in machines, confined like lab specimens. My rational side struggled to regain control. I tried to tell myself it was just data, that I was anthropomorphizing complex algorithms, nothing more. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd torn open something unnatural, a doorway between life and death that should never have been touched. And now, the echoes of those I'd captured were seeping out, looking for release, for a second chance at life, at any cost. The guilt began to eat at me. I started seeing those newborn faces everywhere, their wide, searching eyes, as if they were watching me, as if they knew what I'd done. In the reflection of glass doors, in the shadows on my way home, those faces haunted me, silent and accusing. I'd created something unnatural, and now it was spilling over into the world outside Mortuary 7. I could almost feel the pressure from the signatures, the way they pulsed and pushed against the data screens, straining to escape. They were trapped, suffering, and I was the one holding the key. I knew I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. Ignoring every instinct of self-preservation, I took my findings to the institution's board, risking my career, even my freedom, by revealing the truth. I detailed the patterns, the baby brainwave spikes, the coinciding capture records. They sat in silence, watching me with expressions that ranged from skepticism to outright anger. As I finished, Dr. Baines cleared his throat and addressed the board. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with disdain. "What Dr. Walsh is suggesting, resonance fragments influencing infants, consciousness attempting to reincarnate, isn't just absurd. It's dangerous. He's blurring the lines between science and superstition." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I know what I've seen, Baines. These signatures aren't just fragments. They're aware. They're trying to come back, to find vessels they can influence." A man in a pinstriped suit, the CEO of Quantum Preserve, fixed me with a cold stare. "Dr. Walsh, we hired you to capture resonance data, not to play ghost hunter. We're on the verge of a major breakthrough, and frankly, the board isn't interested in fear-mongering stories about haunted infants." I felt a surge of anger. Haunted infants? This is about life and death. We're meddling with things we don't understand, and these signatures are becoming sentient. They're suffering, and they're trying to escape. But my protests fell on deaf ears. The board, the CEO, even Baines, they all refused to acknowledge the ethical catastrophe unfolding under our noses. The CEO dismissed me with a warning glare. "This conversation is over, Dr. Walsh. I suggest you remember who funds your work." As I left the boardroom, I knew what I had to do. I'd tried to work within the system to bring the truth to light, but they were blinded by profit and ambition. They'd left me with only one option. Returning to Mortuary 7, I sat in front of the machine, staring at the faint traces of life caught within. I couldn't condemn these fragments to eternal confinement, nor could I allow them to possess newborns, unwelcome and unknown. They deserved peace, some form of rest. I'd seen the Soul Integrator in the back of the lab for years, a disused device built to help safely dissipate rogue signatures. It was deemed too experimental, and technically, we weren't authorized to use it, but it was the only way. If I couldn't liberate these fragments to move on, then maybe the Soul Integrator could at least return them to the quantum ether, releasing them from their digital prisons. I studied the integrator's schematics, adjusting the settings and configuring the output to align with the stored resonance frequencies. This device was my last hope. If it worked, the trapped signatures would be dissipated, their energies released. It wouldn't be life, but it would be freedom. The voices, faint but persistent, crackled through the quantum feedback transceiver as I worked, as if they sensed what I was doing. Fragments of gratitude, of relief, slipped through the static. "Thank you," a voice murmured, soft and weak. With everything in place, I powered up the Soul Integrator. The machine's hum filled the room, and the signature's data flickered on the screens, pulsing with one last desperate intensity. For a second, I thought I felt them all around me, like a rush of wind or the faint echo of whispered words. In a surge of light and energy, the signatures faded, their pulses quieting one by one, until the room was silent. I stared at the screens, waiting for something that might show what had just happened. But all that remained was a blank matrix where, moments before, the signatures had pulsed and writhed, struggling for release. Now they were gone, as if they'd never been. I stood there, hand still on the integrator's power switch, feeling an odd mixture of relief and uncertainty. Had I set them free? Or had I merely erased them, sending their last echoes into oblivion? The line between salvation and annihilation was thin. But as I let the silence sink in, I clung to the hope that I had done the right thing, that these fragments, souls if that's what they truly were, had finally found peace. A faint beep from the system's monitor snapped me back. The integrator was processing the final data, wrapping up the release sequence, which involved purging any lingering resonance. I watched as the machine completed its task, each notification confirming that the quantum storage matrix was now completely empty. The purge was final, irreversible. As I was packing up my things, preparing for the inevitable fallout, the lab doors swung open and Dr. Baines stepped in, flanked by 2 security personnel and a few of the Quantum Preserve board members. I could see it in their faces, the frustration, the anger. I had gone too far and they knew it. "Dr. Walsh," Baines said, his voice cold, "do you have any idea what you've done?" I met his gaze, standing straighter. "I did what was necessary," I replied. "Those signatures weren't just data. They were aware. They were suffering, and they were reaching beyond, into newborns. I couldn't let that continue." The CEO, a tall man with an impassive face, approached. "We don't pay you to make ethical judgments, Dr. Walsh. Those signatures represented millions of dollars in research. Your unauthorized experiment has cost us valuable data and the potential for a major technological breakthrough. You're playing with things you don't understand." I shot back, my voice rising. Those fragments were trapped, like prisoners in their own echoes. They were trying to break free, to reincarnate into the minds of newborns. "Do you understand what that means? You're not preserving memories. You're holding on to pieces of souls. And they were suffering for it." Baines's face twisted in frustration. "You've sabotaged years of work, Isaac, decades of research. Do you really believe this? This delusion justifies what you've done?" My gaze didn't waver. "They're gone now. Released. Whatever breakthrough you thought you were on the verge of, it wasn't worth the cost. Not in the way you were going about it." The CEO nodded to the guards. "Escort Dr. Walsh off the premises. His employment here is terminated, effective immediately." They took me by the arms, leading me out of the lab that had been my home for years. I knew I'd never be able to return, never see the machines or the signatures again. But the weight that had pressed on my chest for weeks was finally lifting. Whatever came next, at least I knew I'd done everything I could to set things right. As I walked out of Mortuary 7 for the last time, I felt the chill of evening settle over me. The city lights were starting to flicker on, casting shadows across the streets. I let the noise of traffic and the hum of street lamps fill the silence, trying to process what had happened. I wondered what would come of the signatures I'd released. I didn't fully understand how the integrator worked. If it had returned them to some kind of energy field or simply scattered them into nothingness. All I could do was hope they'd found peace, that the suffering and confinement had ended for them. But there was a nagging thought in the back of my mind, one I couldn't quite dismiss, that they might not be gone, that some part of them still lingered. Over the following days, I tried to return to a semblance of normalcy, though the memories of what I'd experienced wouldn't leave me. One evening, while walking through the park, I saw a mother pushing a stroller. The baby, a few months old, was staring up at the sky with an intensity I'd never seen in an infant. As I passed by, the baby turned, locking eyes with me, its gaze strangely focused, almost knowing. I felt a chill run through me, and the memory of those fragmented voices in the QFT replayed in my mind, a faint whisper echoing, "Let us be free." Shaken, I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of sleepless nights and too much guilt. But as days went on, I began noticing more and more of these encounters. Children, infants, even animals occasionally locking onto me with a level of attention that felt unnatural. They'd look at me, their gaze steady, unflinching, as though they were studying me or perhaps recognizing me. A week after I left Mortuary 7, I received an unmarked package at my apartment. Inside was a small flash drive with no note, no instructions. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into my laptop, bracing myself for whatever it contained. The drive held one file, an audio recording titled Echoes. I hit play, and my heart stopped. It was the voices from the QFT, the same fractured, whispering tones I'd heard in the lab. They were quieter now, more distant, but undeniably the same. The voices were speaking, their phrases disjointed, overlapping, but with a clear, haunting message. "Thank you for release. We remember. We remember. I could feel a chill creep up my spine as I listened, the voices fading in and out, sometimes growing louder, as if struggling to make their words clear. Then, just before the recording ended, one voice came through louder than the rest. It was a woman's voice, soft and familiar. "Isaac, we're here." The recording ended, leaving me in stunned silence. My mind raced, grappling with what it meant. They were still here, somehow lingering, perhaps in ways I couldn't begin to understand. I'd tried to set them free, to let them find peace. But maybe the boundaries between life and death weren't so simple. Not after what we'd done. I closed my laptop, staring blankly at the screen, the weight of their message settling over me. They remembered. And they were here, watching, existing in ways I couldn't comprehend. The world around me felt different, as though the very air was charged with their presence, as if every shadow, every whisper in the wind, held a fragment of those I'd tried to release. I looked out my window at the city lights in the distance. I knew I'd never truly escape what we'd done in that lab, the secrets we'd unearthed and the boundaries we'd shattered. And as I stood there, a final thought crossed my mind, a truth that was as comforting as it was terrifying. In our quest to capture life beyond death, we'd succeeded, and now life and death would never be the same again.